Welcome to Rich Planet TV and today's Scamdemic update. I'm Richard D. Hall. Are you managing to hold on to your sanity as the madness continues? George Orwell once said that in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. In addition to today's new show, I have uploaded more third-party videos to the Scamdemic section of the Rich Planet website that you might want to watch, listed here. Also, please note that I have added some new book titles to the Rich Planet online shop, competitively priced, some very interesting reading. Visit this link to have a look. I've not created a new video since February 21 due to multiple reasons, including my personal circumstances and due to carrying out more renovation work on my house. This work is just about complete, so I can now become more active in fighting the tyranny that's trying to take away our freedom. Now, after these shows go out, I receive considerable numbers of emails which often contain links to online videos. I don't usually read the emails on the day they arrive, and I've now lost count of the number of times I've clicked on a recommended PooTube link only to find that the video has been removed by PooTube. I ask, will you please, if you see a video that you think is important, make a copy of it and re-upload it to a non-PooTube video host. PooTube is a global spider's web, and people have been lured by the convenience of free video hosting, making PooTube on most people's computers the only place that they watch videos from. Once PooTube lured the whole world into their web, they then changed their rules, allowing themselves to be the unelected, draconian censor of 99.9% of all internet videos, in such a way that protects the global cabal who are running the COVID scam and who are running many other psyops and scams. And don't forget to click subscribe. Bollocks! Don't forget to find another way to host and distribute your videos. That's what you've got to not forget to do. Don't subscribe to me on the draconian PooTube. Subscribe to my website, www.richplanet.net, follow this link, and then subscribe to the Rich Planet updates. Now, here's a clip from the previous show. One country not on that list is Burundi, whose 55-year-old president, Pierre Nkurunziza, refused to implement lockdown measures, then died unexpectedly of a heart attack on the 8th of June 2020. He was replaced immediately by a WHO sympathiser who imposed lockdown rules. Another African skeptic of lockdown is President of Tanzania, John Magufuli, who returned coronavirus test kits as faulty because he tested samples taken from a goat and a pawpaw and they came back positive. Let's hope he doesn't have a sudden heart attack too. On the 17th of March, it was reported that John Magufuli had died of heart failure. Clearly, it was just a coincidence. He was a world leader who had seen through the COVID scam and had rejected all the measures being demanded by the New World Order's global COVID-19 program. It looks like the new leadership in Tanzania is now fully compliant with the COVID scam agenda. I'd love to know the truth about his death, but you'll struggle to find that in the lamestream media. In the UK, the overall 2020 figures for all-cause mortality, that's all deaths, show that there was no pandemic in the UK. Total death figures for 2020 certainly show a lot more deaths than in 2019, but approximately 608,000 deaths represents 1.01% of the total population. If you go back and check the figures for 2000, you will find that 1.03% of the population died, and in 1976 it was 1.2%. There were no restrictions in those years or mass vaccinations either. Another confirmation that there was no pandemic comes from the number of recorded hospital admissions. For example, in Derbyshire, 140,950 admissions were logged. This compares to 195,427 admissions for the same period in 2019. This is a 28% drop in admissions. Similar figures from Northern Ireland, with some hospitals there showing a 40% drop in admissions in 2020 compared to the previous year. This can be verified locally with an FOI request to your local health authority. This means that people were not becoming sick enough to go into hospital, hence were unaffected by a pandemic. Here's an FOI request from NHS Stockport, showing that hospital admissions in 2020 were significantly lower than in 2019 and 2018, strongly suggesting that there was no pandemic. We don't have to get into any science to know that there was no pandemic. The hospital admission figures alone show that no significant portion of the population got ill enough to go to hospital. The scale of public gullibility is staggering. Millions of seemingly intelligent people who have responsible positions are exhibiting mass delusional disorder. I know of people who hold very good government-paid jobs who, perhaps understandably, became concerned when they first heard news about people suffering physical symptoms which were being caused by a virus. They agreed to be tested for the virus and initially tested negative, and tested negative over a dozen times. Despite testing negative for every test and despite suffering no symptoms, a government fear campaign was so persuasive they decided to get a vaccination to protect themselves against the imaginary virus. Well, 2 vaccinations in fact. After their vaccination program, which presumably protected them from the virus, for some bizarre reason, they continued having weekly tests for the virus while still having no physical symptoms whatsoever. Then one of their tests happened to show up positive. So what did they decide to do? They decided to self-isolate for 2 weeks, even though they'd already been protected by a vaccine and even though they showed no physical symptoms whatsoever. But a good friend helped out with this knotty problem. She's obviously caught the Indian variant. You know, because the current vaccine doesn't protect against that. Now, if you don't think what I have just described there shows that these people are suffering from a delusional disorder, let me reread what I just stated and imagine that instead of the world being plagued by an imaginary virus, the world is being plagued by, let's say, poltergeists. What would it sound like? I'll read it again. I know of people who hold very good government-paid jobs who, perhaps understandably, became concerned when they first heard news about people suffering physical disturbances which were being caused by poltergeists. They agreed to have their houses tested for poltergeists by a priest and initially tested negative over a dozen times. Despite testing negative and despite suffering no physical disturbances in their homes, a government fear campaign was so persuasive they decided to get an exorcism carried out to protect themselves and their property against the poltergeist. Well, 2 exorcisms in fact. After their exorcism program, which presumably protected themselves against the poltergeist, for some bizarre reason, they continued having weekly tests by the priest for poltergeists, while still having no physical disturbances in their home whatsoever. Then one of the priest's tests happened to show up positive. So what did they decide to do? They decided to self-isolate from the imaginary poltergeist and moved out of their house for 2 weeks, even though they'd already been protected by an exorcism and even though there were no physical disturbances in the house whatsoever. But a good friend helped out with this knotty problem. She's obviously got the vampire variant poltergeist. The current exorcisms don't protect against them. Can't these fools see there is no poltergeist, just as there is no dangerous virus? This whole scam was based on an alleged virus, a virus which has not been isolated and therefore not proven to exist. A side note here about bacteria. With the alleged SARS-CoV-2, obviously they are talking about a supposed virus, not a bacteria. A bacteria particle is invisible to the naked eye, and it is claimed that virus particles are even smaller. But unlike alleged virus particles, bacteria is a living, single-cell organism and can survive outside of your body. And yes, some bacteria in certain circumstances can cause you to become ill. The much smaller and flimsier particle, the alleged virus particle, however, of which there exists massive misinformation, cannot survive outside of a host. The fake pandemic is based on a foundation of probably flawed assumptions about what are termed viruses. Here are the assumptions that I question. Firstly, that viruses can and do cause disease. Secondly, that viruses are transmissible through the air from person to person. And thirdly, even that certain viruses exist. These three assumptions are almost always presumed to be true when this rancid topic is being discussed. There are many videos which analyse the COVID statistics and draw conclusions about the transmission of the virus. These videos include those who look at the official statistics and try to show that lockdown measures are pointless. One such example is Ivor Cummins. But I can't see any value in this sort of analysis because all analysis of the official statistics assumes, 1, that a new virus called SARS-CoV-2 exists. It assumes 2, that the unproven virus transfers from one person to another through the air, and it assumes 3, that the unproven virus is what is causing people to have certain symptoms. It assumes 4, that the PCR test works. Too many assumptions. I would challenge every single one of them. All the statistics and any analysis is pointless unless you know those assumptions are true. I don't believe anyone has proven any of those assumptions to be true. The reason these assumptions are usually assumed to be true is because in the past a number of well-known diseases have been wrongly assumed to satisfy the first 3 criteria. For example, Dr. Stefan Lanka proposed that no measles virus exists and therefore that the measles disease is not transferred by a virus through the air from one person to another. He is not saying that the measles disease doesn't exist, it clearly does. He is saying that measles is not caused by a virus. Nobody in science has been able to prove him wrong. Dr. Stefan Lanka has recently produced a new paper and states that the COVID virus is a mental construct which has no basis in reality. In this video, he explains the deeply flawed science which tries to and fails to show that SARS-CoV-2 is real.
Well, in my latest paper, I outlined 7 points. When you just notice them, read their papers, you will see that they have disproven themselves with their own writing, right? Of course, you realize they are completely anti-scientific because they are not questioning the base, the historical base, and what they are doing. It's just a belief system. They are doing it in faith, and they came up with the conclusion. This and that. So, speaking about the pictures, you will see in the description how a picture was done, what happened to this. You will find out that this has never been isolated, this structure, but sedimented in a test tube, cell culture style, never a blood, never tissue from a human being or an animal. So it all those cell cultures, and this had to be pelleted down, not isolated, and then they make a photo where other biologists know, hey, you show typical structures called villi, for example. When you have a dot of tissue on a petri dish, then it gets its fingers out, called villi. Fluid out, stick there, tearing itself, and they walk like this, and they try to unite with each other again, building the tissue, right? So, and this, when they cut through this, they say, look, this is a spherical thing, but never ever have proven it is spherical. And they never analyzed and never did the biochemistry of this particle. Does it really has the proteins of the virus? Is there really the nucleic acid then? So it's easy to check this, very easy. You see only they work with structures from cell cultures and never ever were able to visualize something in the blood, in you know, from your mouth, from urine, from sperm, from all other kind of liquid or tissue in the body. Never ever. So this is easily be seen.
You once said you can get any virus you want out of cell culture. Why are you so confident about that?
Well, as there is no virus out there when the cells are dying, then they built up a picture. They made a picture of a virus. It's a mental construct, and the model for this in the first time it was a bacteriophage. And there you find always a nucleic acid, a certain length, a certain sequence, always the same, surrounded by proteins in its shell, right? So, and they never found it. So they came up and in the belief system that the virus was there killing the cells, that turning the material into viral matter. So taking some proteins out and said, look, this is part of the model here and there. And the same they did with the genetic material. Because the new model of virology after 51 was that the virus, the toxin of disease, is a dangerous piece of genetic material. It could be naked, the poor viruses, Ebola, a naked genetic material, or it could be enveloped, right? Like measles virus, corona with, a corona. So this is what it is, and what they are doing with the genetic material, as they never were able to isolate a piece, even not the whole piece. In case of coronavirus, 30,000 building blocks called nucleotides. Never ever. Even its standard technique since decades to show that you have a long nucleic acid present. Then you pick it up, you sequence it, and you repeat it, you always came up with the same thing. They never were able to. What they are doing, they use very short sequences which they found in their dying cells and add them up in mentally using programs and add them up to a given sequence. And this is called alignment. So they align very short pieces to a big one. Then they find, 50% is missing. Well, but at this place the protein look like this, and if the protein should be like this, the genetic sequence then has to be like this. And they make the gap filling. They call it like this. And then at the end you have a mental construct which has no base in reality. No base. It's just an idealistic model.
So how can they do that? Is there a computer program?
Yeah, before when they got the sequence, start to sequence, they wrote down the sequence on paper, by hand. And they did the alignment with hand, really, and it took them along. And now they're doing it with computer programs. One name, it's MegaHit, Trinity, it's another name of those programs. Out of millions of very short molecules, they add up and try to fit where this short piece, this puzzle, is fitting to the given picture, to the genome. And it's a mental construct, and you have just to read it, and then you see it. It's called alignment.
But the given picture, is there a given picture? Or
no, there's not a picture like the virus should look like. Its shell consisting out of proteins and probably a membrane around, but they say the genetic substance has this size and this sequence.
But how do they know if they never isolated one?
They invented it. And the first viruses, human viruses, they orientate themselves on the genetic material of bacteriophages. And then on genetic material everywhere. And they found, this is part of the human being. So now they keep saying 50% of our genetic material in the chromosomes are viral. genetic material. But in reality, they have never been viral. They're using it, build them up mentally to come up with a picture of a whole viral genetic material. It's termed as well genome, a viral genome. But it's always a mental construct. And here as well, they did never control experiments. So that they treat the cell culture in the same way, put some proteins on it, but sterilized, so when proteins go into decay, putrefaction, this is of course interfering with life, so the cells dying quicker, of course, and they go, oh, it's the viral effect, cytopathic effect, when cells are dying. And this, then they took out of this liquid, never out of a structure which they isolated. So they didn't isolate structure like bacteriophages, like the giant viruses. Hundreds of virologists are doing every day. They are not doing it. They just take very small molecules, sequence them, and align them to a given sequence. In our project Emmanuel, you are going to see we animated the process of alignment, so you could easily see what they are doing.
So that's the next step. You're showing the people the experiments that the virologists do.
And we are asking since long that virologists are performing the control experiment. Now at the moment, Samuel Eckert is offering 200,000 euro for the virologist, the German virologist, Professor Christian Drosten, and just naming sentences out of scientific papers saying, here we isolate this structure, and here we isolate the genetic material out of this structure. This saying, even though its wording doesn't appear in this publication.
You can find out more about Dr. Stefan Lanker's project Emmanuel from this link. And the same can be said of HIV. HIV does not cause the disease or syndrome known as AIDS, and there is even doubt, according to some, over whether the HIV virus exists. What about flu? If you know of any scientific trials where somebody with flu symptoms has had infected material taken from their body, then put into healthy people, showing that those healthy people all then develop flu symptoms, please send it to me. Because as far as I am aware, they have never been able to demonstrate in a realistic controlled experiment that one person can catch flu from another via virus particles. Let me repeat that. As far as I am aware, they have never been able to demonstrate in a realistic controlled experiment that one person can catch flu from another via virus particles. Just because 2, 3 or 4 or more people all get the same flu-like symptoms at the same time or sequentially one immediately after the other does not mean that they transmitted the disease via a virus from one person to another and then to another. The manifestation of disease into your body, such as flu, is more subtle than merely breathing in someone else's spit. If you're scratching your head at these revelations, then please research German New Medicine if you want some ideas on how diseases may be triggered in the body, and possibly triggered simultaneously in more than one person, making people draw the incorrect conclusion that certain diseases are physically transmissible. Now, if it's true that some people have suffered unusual symptoms during this so-called pandemic, it's possible to explain the symptoms without a virus being involved by considering the discoveries of German New Medicine, which asserts that the psychological impact caused by the disruption, the frustration, the isolation, the deprivation of lockdown and fear can result in clearly identifiable physical symptoms. I think before you debate the COVID scam with anyone, you need to try and pull them back to discuss these fundamental points about how diseases occur, like pulling a greyhound back into its trap before it bolts off chasing a fake rabbit. If you can't establish and show the truth about these fairly basic assumptions, then everything you then talk about is flawed and becomes a phony bone of contention. You are just filling the world with hot air and helping to perpetuate this global scam. Even if you do believe that viruses behave in the way that it is claimed, all the statistics are still nonsense, because the main confirmatory test, the PCR test, which has been used to concoct the statistics, doesn't work. It's been thrown out in 3 court cases now, in Portugal, Australia, and in Germany. Any statements based on the use of case statistics is false and would not stand up in court. All those fear-mongering graphs that the lamestream media have been using for over a year now are all false. Deaths in 2020 in the UK were not significantly above normal. Hospital admissions in 2020 in the UK were significantly below normal. These 2 facts tell you that there was no pandemic. The higher than average mortality rate in 2020, about 10%, which, as I said earlier, was lower than in 2000 and lower than in 1976, could be attributed to the lockdown measures themselves. Many routine operations were cancelled, which affected people's health. People were made to believe their lives were at risk and suffered in fear for long periods. Uncertainty and isolation for long periods. If you are old and frail, these sort of factors can make the difference between life and death. There was no pandemic in 2020, and there is no evidence of a deadly virus. Here is an extract from an intelligent person from an email I received written by a university academic who teaches degree-level mathematics. He states, "I have spent the last 18 months in a state of exasperation, frustration and disbelief. Disbelief that so many people can be fooled by such an obvious fraud. I have been particularly disappointed with those in academia, some of whom understand the fraud but choose to remain silent for various reasons, and the majority who unforgivably allow themselves to be brainwashed along with the masses. Such has been my disgust that I took the decision this week to resign and cut all my ties with the university and academic world. I now find the dogma, arrogance, corruption and cluelessness intolerable. I recently had a number of long conversations with fellow doctors and professors, and it was evident that none of them had the slightest clue what I was talking about with regards to COVID crime. They, like nearly all of their colleagues, live in what I call the BBC bubble, a world that you and I know bears no resemblance to reality."